What happens when black people say no? When we demand more? When we stand up and refuse to stay seated? That's what this story is about. But it's also about the response to black agency. Because black progress has always been met with backlash, with punishment. This is the second story in our Black Resistance series. In this series, we've been exploring how black people responded to injustice, and sometimes how our response was met with even more injustice. In the first video, I told you about Lula Sherman, a 14-year-old black girl who suffered unspeakable brutality, and how the black community responded in a way that shocked the very system that failed to protect her. In this video, we turn to a different kind of resistance, one rooted in economics, in labor, in dignity, in the right to set the price for your own work. And we'll see the price that black people pay just for saying we are worth more. These stories are not easy to hear, but they must be told. And I want to thank you for walking with me as we remember how we lived and how we died and how we resisted. This story takes place in 1907 on the eastern shore of Virginia in a small coastal town called Onancock. Onancock sits in Accomack County, the northernmost part of the peninsula that makes up Virginia's two eastern counties. But before I tell you what happened, I need to give you some historical context first, so you understand the time, the place, and the environment this injustice took root in. At the turn of the 20th century, Virginia's eastern shore was geographically isolated, but it was economically booming. Cut off from the mainland by the Chesapeake Bay, it was a region of pine woods and farmers and fishing villages, a place where prosperity was rising, but not equally shared. In Accomack County, black residents made up over 1/3 of the population. In neighboring Northampton, they were the majority. Yet, while white men thrived as landowning farmers and watermen, black residents were mostly relegated to tenant farming and manual labor. Agricultural wealth surged through a farmers' cooperative that opened new markets for sweet potatoes and produce, a boom that transformed towns like Onancock. With about 1,000 residents, Onancock stood as a small but bustling port town. Steamboats moved the county's goods, and new wealth reshaped the landscape, and white families relocated into town to access schools and social life. But even in prosperity, the divide was clear. Onancock's white neighborhoods boasted brick buildings and manicured gardens. Its black residents lived on the town's edge, close-knit and hard-working, and largely employed in service to the white economy. Their community had its own paper, its own businesses, and its own dignity. But the racial lines were drawn, and as we'll see here, they were about to be reinforced with violence. Now, I want to be clear about something. What happened in 1907 wasn't a surprise, not if you know the land or the pattern. This part of Virginia had a history of racial violence long before that August night. Freedmen were terrorized here just after the Civil War. A lynching took place in the county's southern end. And in the years that followed, there were flare-ups in court squares and in streets and in towns across the peninsula. So when things started to escalate in Onancock in 1907, the soil had already been tilled. The conditions were already there. The trouble in Onancock didn't start with violence. It started with labor, with black men and black women finally demanding to be paid what their work was worth. For decades, white farmers on the eastern shore had struggled to find enough labor, and many black families were already leaving, heading north to cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia, looking for better wages and freer lives. But the ones who stayed began to organize. They knew their value. They passed resolutions. They set fair prices, and they stood together. And that's what made them a threat. Not because they raised their voices, but because they raised their worth. And in the Jim Crow South, that alone could spark a riot. Now let me tell you about the black people involved in this. First, there's Samuel L. Burton. Born September 30th, 1869 in Virginia to James and Maria Burton. Samuel was born just 3 years after slavery ended. Both his parents were born in the 1840s, 2 decades before emancipation. So it's likely that they experienced enslavement. After emancipation, Samuel's parents worked the best they could, in a time when everything and everyone was trying to drag them back into chains. His father, James, worked the land as a farmer, like many black people did after freedom, using the same skill they honed and perfected in bondage. His mother, Maria, worked as a housekeeper. Despite all the injustice that was occurring, Samuel made it to adulthood. And he didn't just make it, he thrived. Samuel could read and he could write, something a lot of black people fresh into freedom could not do. Education was not valued for black people. Not that black people didn't value it, but that it was not something that those committed to black injustice wanted to see. An educated black population was always seen as a threat to Jim Crow's rule. And Samuel used his education to help his people. He taught at Accomack County Color Schools, helping to bring black children out of the darkness of illiteracy and into the light of education. Samuel later go on to open a general store in the black section of Onancock, providing much-needed groceries and supplies to his people. His store earned $10,000 a year. That's around $350,000 today. He was also active in black social life. Samuel was the head of the Black Masons and the Odd Fellows. He also served as a leader and officer of the Black Agricultural Fair Association. And there was something else. If all of this wasn't enough, Samuel managed to do something that black people rarely did in those times. He owned land, a lot of it. This is something we were able to confirm by looking at the census records from 1900. Samuel was a wealthy and respected black man who cared about the upliftment of his people. He didn't just care about himself. He wanted all black people to continue stepping further away from the shackles of slavery and into the freedom that democracy and citizenship were supposed to bring. When black people in the community needed advice, they turned to Samuel. He cared. He was one of them. So much so that even though he was not laboring in the fields, he still advocated for black farm workers. He told black people to make sure they demanded fair pay and told them only to buy from black people, to keep the dollar moving in their own community. Samuel's outspoken leadership and his resistance to economic injustice is what would end up costing him everything. But before I get to that part, there's one more important person I need to tell you about. James Usel was born around 1872 in Virginia. Like Samuel, he too was well educated. And also like Samuel, James wore many hats. He was the principal of the black school in Onancock and also served as the editor of the Peninsula Times. James was also active socially. He served as the secretary of the Colored Teachers Association in Accomack, a position that Samuel had held before him. And together, Samuel and James ran the Central Agricultural Fair Association. Samuel was the president and James was the secretary. Every year, they put on the Color Fair, a time for education and enjoyment for black people in the county. James, like Samuel, also was a fierce leader in the wage labor movement that was taking place in Onancock. He printed articles urging black laborers to demand better pay. These two black men were doing everything they could to uplift, educate, and empower their people in this small corner of Virginia. But their quiet resistance to injustice and racism was about to be met with the full force of Jim Crow's power. This goes to something that I'm always talking about. There are so many black people who contributed to the survival of our people. Not just the 5 names that get repeated every year in February, but black people in all corners of this country stood tall, with straight backs and square shoulders, and said, "I do not accept your unjust label. Slavery may have been our past, but it won't be our future." And that's why these stories are so important. Why the work we're doing with our Memory Justice Project is so vital. So we can move out of the comfortable narratives of black history that get repeated over and over again. We have to learn about our people and tell our story. No one else will. In fact, some are doing everything they can to erase it completely. And to learn about what Samuel and James were doing just 40 years out of slavery stopped me in my tracks. It was inspiring, but also a little bit scary, because I knew that an injustice was about to come. This kind of black empowerment is always met with a backlash. But what is interesting to me about that statement is that I say that from the perspective of studying 160 years of repeated white backlash to black progress. I know the eras. I know how Jim Crow responded. That's why I'm not shocked by what we're seeing today. It's the same playbook that's been used before. But for Samuel and James, they didn't know. The playbook was still being written, still being perfected. And I wondered, how did they think this was going to end? Their message of black economic independence, what did they think would happen? Were they prepared for the backlash? Because they didn't have the same view that I have reading it in hindsight. They knew the injustice of the day. They knew convict leasing, knew black people were lynched. But they didn't yet know that Jim Crow was not going to back down. Not in 1907. Not in 1957. He was committed to his plan of black injustice. I don't want to go on too long on that point, but it was something that I reflected on as I read about this story and dug deeper into it. The backlash, the response. And that's what I want to talk about next. Whites were not happy with what was occurring. All this talk of black people standing up for themselves, demanding better pay, wanting to be treated fairly, that was not good for Jim Crow's profits. And this had to be stopped. The injustice that was about to happen all started over $2. In August of 1907, 22-year-old Sylvanus Conquest worked at Samuel Burton's store as a clerk. Conquest owed $2 to a white man named John Fosk. He had rented a horse and buggy from Fosk, and when he failed to pay the debt, even though it was only $2, Fosk didn't let it go. He went to court and got a judgment against Conquest for the money owed. After securing the judgment, he took it to the authorities to enforce it. On August 9th, 36-year-old Constable Tankard Kellum came to Burton's store to carry out the court order. He was going to seize Conquest's horse to satisfy the debt. Conquest told the constable that it wasn't his horse and that he couldn't take it, that he had been taking care of someone else's property. The two began to argue. Now remember, Constable Kellum was the law, and he was a white man. And Sylvanus Conquest was just a young black man saying no to a white man in a time when a black no could lead to a black death. Samuel saw what was going on, and he quickly sided with Conquest in the matter. After that, more black people began to crowd around. The scene got intense. Kellum was white, and as I said before, he was the law. But he was outnumbered here, and this was a situation that he did not want to be in. So he quickly left. The black people, tired of constant injustice and unfairness, thought they had won the day. But they were wrong. They were very wrong. Samuel wanted the matter to be resolved. He didn't want this to go any further. So later that same day, he paid the debt for Conquest. He thought that ended it. It didn't. That same day, Constable Kellum got a warrant for Conquest's arrest. He said that Conquest had resisted arrest in the store. Conquest was made to come before the mayor of Onancock, Leonidas Doherty. Samuel Burton was also made to come down. He testified at the hearing, told what happened, told the truth. When Samuel was done testifying, he was ordered to leave. Apparently, he moved too slowly for Constable Kellum's liking. Kellum, still upset about what happened in the store, yanked the chair from under Samuel, causing him to fall. The mayor then quickly found Conquest guilty of resisting arrest and fined him $50, even though the debt was only $2. The $50 fine wasn't just about the debt. It was to send a message that if black people wanted a wage increase, they better pay their fees on time. Conquest and Samuel both told the officials how unfair their treatment had been, but they didn't want any further escalation, so they left. Once again, this should have ended it, but it did not. White people in town were livid over what happened. They took issue with the way that black people had acted in the store towards Kellum, so they sent a message. Any black person who planned to shop on the white side of town that Saturday had to leave by 8:30 p.m. If I could just pause here for just one moment, because that demand that black people leave by 8:30 p.m., that wasn't just about that Saturday. It was something deeper, something older. Historians call it the sundown town phenomenon. By the early 1900s, all across this country, black people knew what it meant when a town told them to be gone by dark. These weren't official laws. They didn't have to be. The warning was clear. Stay past sundown and you'd face violence or a lynching. Some towns even had signs at the city limits. Others just used the mob. It was all about control, about reminding black people that even though they could work in the town, they couldn't belong to it. So when the white people in Onancock said, "Be gone by 8:30," they were enforcing a pattern that stretched far beyond that little town. Now, I don't want to get too deep into sundown towns because this is a part of history that really gets talked about, but it does go to show you that Jim Crow had no shortage of tools when it came to inflicting injustice on black people. Before I get back to the story, I think it's important to reflect and take this in, because on its face, this might not seem like much. A dispute over $2. No one was hit, no one was injured, just a disagreement at a store. But in Jim Crow's world, a black man saying no was never just a disagreement. Black people couldn't argue, couldn't protest, couldn't even dispute a debt without putting their lives at risk. Fairness was a fiction. Injustice was the rule. And black resistance, no matter how small, was always seen as a threat. Because if Jim Crow was offended, it didn't matter the size of the offense. It didn't matter if it was just words or just silence or just standing too slow. The response was always the same: punishment, humiliation, backlash. Jim Crow was about to show you exactly what he thought about your resistance. The warning had gone out to all black people: stay away, be gone by 8:30. James Usual made his way to the white section of town around 8 p.m. that night, 30 minutes before the curfew the whites had set for black people. He walked toward the post office. That's when 5 young men leaving R.L. Shield and Company store saw him. They went straight over to James, told him that it was past his bedtime, that he needed to leave. James didn't like this, but he kept his cool. He told the white man that he wasn't bothering anyone and he didn't want any trouble. But the men didn't care. They responded with violence. They beat James, knocked him down, hit him and struck him, and they beat him badly. So badly that James feared for his life. What the white man didn't know was that James was armed. James couldn't take it anymore, and he pulled out his revolver and fired twice at the men. The firing scattered the attackers, and James slipped away, escaping into the shadows behind the Episcopal Church. But he didn't just fire. He struck one of the men, Garland Belloc. He was hit in the thigh. It wasn't fatal, but he had been struck, and struck by a black man. And that sealed it. After the firing, white men came pouring into the streets. They wanted to know what happened. The street filled quickly. That's when the rumors started spreading. James had done nothing but try to go to the post office, but to whites in town, something bad was happening. Belloc had been struck, and earlier that day, black people had dared to stand up in their store. Now the story began to spread. That black people were rising up, that they were going to burn the town, massacre white citizens, violate white women, and loot white property. It wasn't true, but it didn't have to be. That was the spark. A $2 debt over a horse and buggy was now about to ignite black suffering and black pain. The mob wanted Usual. He had fought back. But they also wanted someone else, Samuel Burton. Now, Sam had nothing to do with the fight between Usual and the white man, but it didn't matter, because to them, he was the root of all of this unrest. He was a troublemaker, a ringleader, the man who dared to preach black empowerment right there in their town. And he was going to pay for it. Samuel's life was now in danger, even though he didn't even know what had happened. A young white man named J.C. Westcott heard what was being planned for Samuel and sent someone to deliver a warning: leave town immediately or risk being lynched. When Samuel got the message, he was still at his store with Savannah's Conquest. They turned down the lights inside so no one could see them. They then quietly closed up the shop and left. They ran into the woods to hide. This day started like a normal day. Samuel opened his store and planned to serve his community like he had done countless times before. Savannah's Conquest. He had a job, a good one, working for a black man, not laboring in the fields for slave wages. He thought he'd go to work and return home to his family, like he had done many times before. Neither of them knew that it would end like this, hiding in the woods, like they were runaway slaves. Neither man had harmed anyone. Neither man had committed a crime, not one that was on the books. But they did commit a crime, the crime of being black and present. Black and present in the same room with Jim Crow. That was their crime. Samuel Savanas had nothing to do with what happened at the post office. James had nothing to do with what happened at the store. And yet, all three of their fates were intertwined now. This was a reality for black people. No certainty of life. You can make no plans. You could not make promises about what you would do. Not with Jim Crow around. Because when you slight him, he smites you. When you defend yourself, he destroys your community. His response never matched the reality of what actually occurred. That's what Samuel, Savannah, and James were experiencing. and the lesson they were about to learn. Just like rumors were spreading on the white side of town, they were spreading on the black side too. White people were fearing that a black riot was about to occur, and black people were fearing that white people were about to come and massacre them. So both sides began preparing. They armed themselves. They braced for what they thought was inevitable. It was this fear, this whirlwind of unfounded rumors, that led to an escalation that never had to happen. An escalation rooted not in fact, but in racism. An escalation that started because Jim Crow took offense to black people demanding to be paid fairly, to black people standing up for themselves against unprovoked attacks. At around 8:45 that same evening, a hired carriage known as a hack left Conrad's Hotel in downtown Onancock and headed toward the train station. The carriage was owned by John Fosk, the same man whose $2 debt had started all of this. Inside the carriage was the driver, a black man named Braden Short, who worked for Fosk. Also riding in the carriage were Dr. M.J. Hunt and two other white men. To reach the train station, the carriage had to pass through the black section of town. As they made their way past Samuel Burton's store, Dr. Hunt noticed what he thought was a hog off to the left side of the road. He thought nothing of it, and the carriage kept moving. But it wasn't a hog. It was a black man named John Toppin. He stood up from the shadows and gave a signal, alerting a group of other black men that the carriage was approaching, and that it was time to fire. Black residents had been preparing to defend their community. They believed an attack was coming, and they had positioned themselves near Burton's store, armed and ready. When Toppin gave the signal, the men emerged and opened fire on the carriage. When it was over, the carriage had been riddled with shots, and John Toppin had been struck on the shoulder. Now, just like in the Little Sherman story I told you before this one, I was shocked by this resistance. I did not see it coming. As I was reading the research, I thought I knew where this was headed, that black people were going to be attacked, and maybe, just maybe they would fight back, and maybe it will lead to a small conflict. That's what I had in my head. But then I got to this part, and I had to read it several times because I just couldn't believe it. Black men ambushing white men. Because to me, and probably to you too, that sounds like something that would inevitably trigger a catastrophic response, an overwhelming one. But like I said a few moments ago, the black people in Onancock in 1907 didn't have the same history that we have now. The Red Summer of 1919, when race riots broke out all across the country, was still 12 years away. The Tulsa Race Massacre hadn't happened yet. It was still 14 years away. They didn't know that thousands of black people would be lynched in the decades after 1907. Bull Connor, the police commissioner who beat protesters in Alabama, he was just 10 years old in 1907. And Dr. King wouldn't even be born for another 22 years. So, for those of you asking, what are you getting at, Julian? Well, what I'm getting at and what I mean is this. Their resistance was informed and uninformed at the same time. They knew the first 40 years of so-called freedom. They knew injustice. They knew they were tired. But they didn't know that the fatigue that they felt was something that black people would still be carrying 40, 80, and 100 years later. They didn't know that Jim Crow was just getting started, that he would become more organized, more brutal, and more relentless. They didn't know how long this fight was going to last. We know it. We know it today, but they didn't. Their resistance was momentary. It was urgent. It was human. They acted to protect two men, right then in that moment. But Jim Crow, he plays the long game. He's not singular. He's plural. And his actions echo across generations. That's what they didn't know. And that contrast, the distance between what they felt and what we know, it stayed with me as I was reading this. After the attack on the carriage, white Onancock was in an uproar. They believed that it was retaliation, and they were convinced that black people were about to riot and massacre and storm the white side of town. So they armed themselves. And while they were preparing, officials started looking for Samuel Burton and Sylvanus Conquest. They planned to blame them for everything. More than 36 white men marched straight to Samuel Burton's store. Constable Kellum was leading them. He believed there was a mob of black men waiting inside the store, and he called in reinforcements. By this time, rumors had already spread through the Eastern Shore, and they were wild, exaggerated claims that black people were planning an uprising. White men rushed in from all across the countryside, some as far away as Crisfield, Maryland, more than 50 miles away. By 11 p.m., They were ready to move in, and Kellum gave the order, and the mob fired hundreds of rounds into Samuel's store. They thought the black people would come running out, but no one did. The store was empty. Still not satisfied, they tore through the black section of town, firing at homes and shattering windows and destroying property. But even that wasn't enough. They wanted Samuel. They wanted James. They wanted Sylvanus. And they couldn't find them. So when they couldn't find them, they came back to Samuel's store. This time, they brought gasoline. And they poured it all across the store and burned it to the ground. They did the same thing to James Usel's printing shop. Two black men who had been educated, who organized and uplifted their people, had their life's work reduced to ashes in one night. All over $2. They hadn't stolen. They hadn't attacked anyone. They dared to lead. And they dared to inspire. And leadership by itself wasn't a crime. Inspiration wasn't a crime. But black leadership and black inspiration for black people, that was something different. That was something Jim Crow would not tolerate. With all of this violence and chaos, you'd think that town officials would try to calm things down. No, that's not what happened. The next day, Sunday, August 11th, a meeting was held by white citizens where they appointed the Safety Committee to restore peace. And one of the first things the committee did was to hand over a list of 8 black people they wanted banished from the town. No evidence, no hearings, just names. A few of the black people have been arrested before, but the list also included Onancock's only black doctor, Dr. Imoon, and the pastor of the AME Church, all labeled disturbers of the peace and threats to the welfare of the community. The pastor's great crime was that he cautioned black women about missing church to work in white homes. But they didn't stop with those 8. They went around town, posting notices on black families' doors, ordering them to leave by 4 p.m. that same day. According to the committee, the only way to restore order was to kick black people out. And any black person who might cause trouble had to go. But what counted as trouble wasn't just about breaking the law. It was about whether you encouraged black people to stand up and to demand more. All leading black citizens of the town were ordered to leave. Dr. Moon wasn't just the only black doctor. He was also a leader in the local labor wage movement. He pleaded with the town not to be banished, said he had nothing to do with the riot. It took 2 other white doctors vouching for him, saying that he was a well-behaved black man for the council to let him stay. But even then, they said he had to be on probation. One wrong move, and he was out. Now, today, when we think of probation, we think of someone who's been convicted of a crime but is allowed to stay out of prison under supervision. But here was a black medical doctor who committed no crime, and he was put on probation. Why? Because he was black, because he was successful, because he encouraged other black people to do better. That was it. That made him a felon. That made him banishable. He had to have white men come to court and vouch for him, just to be allowed to stay in the community where he served and pay taxes. This is another example of how Jim Crow's system stripped black people of their dignity, of their pride, of their self-esteem. You walked too high around him, and he would chop you down. You moved too fast, he'd trip you. You spoke too loudly, and he would silence you. That's what was happening to Dr. Moon. And he wasn't the only one. Other black families also suffered. Families who were educated, they had to show and prove that they respected the white community in order to stay in Onancock. First of all, what does that even mean? What does it mean to show that you respect them? Did black people have to beg? Did they have to grovel? Lower themselves to a posture of subservience? I mean, can you imagine living like that? Enduring this? Showing your respect in order to stay in a town where you pay taxes? But even though this was bad, white officials still weren't done. Next, the town passed 2 resolutions. The first was a request to the governor, asking that he send weapons so that white citizens could protect themselves. The second was an injunction, banning black people from holding their annual agricultural fair in Tasley. The reason they gave? Samuel Burton and James Usel were officers in the fair, and now they were fugitives from justice. The fair brought in hundreds, if not thousands of black people from all across the region, and white leaders claimed that they fear more trouble in town. The first resolution was acted upon quickly. Mayor Doherty sent a telegram to Governor Claude Swanson, claiming that a race riot was underway and they needed weapons and ammunition. The governor received the message around 9 p.m., and by 10, he was on a train from Richmond, heading straight to Onancock. By noon the next day, Monday, August 12th, he was there. The governor wasted no time. He ordered troops to Onancock and placed a $150 bounty to capture Samuel, James, and Sylvanus. But the arrival of the military didn't calm things. White residents continued to spread rumors of a black uprising, and for several nights, they fired randomly into the black neighborhood. They broke into black homes and they attacked and violated black women. It got so bad that black women began fleeing their homes at night to avoid white men breaking into their houses under the cover of darkness. And while all of this was going on, there was still an intense manhunt for the three black men. No one had seen them. No one knew where they were. Samuel, James, and Sylvanus were in hiding. There were constant threats to lynch them. But after the commanding military officer promised protection if the men surrendered, that's when things turned. On August 19th at around 4 a.m., James User walked out of the woods and into Onancock. He surrendered to the soldiers. He was immediately taken to the town hall and guarded. Because whites in town still wanted to lynch him, no one was told he was there, not even the mayor. It was too dangerous. If word got out that he was back, another riot would have started. The next day, he was escorted by soldiers to the train and then taken to Norfolk. With James in custody, that left Samuel and Sylvanus. We don't know how, but it's likely some black residents knew where they were, because once word got out that James was safe and that the military had protected him, Samuel and Sylvanus followed suit. 2 days later, they came out of the woods and surrendered to the soldiers. But unlike with James, word got out this time. News spread that they were in custody. Whites gathered near the town hall, planning to seize them. But luckily, the soldiers were there and were able to get them out. They got both men on the train to Norfolk before the mob could act. But again, this story is far from the end of this saga. Because if you've seen our videos before, you know that Jim Crow didn't just control the mobs. He also controlled the courts. And that's where this story goes next. The Accomack County Grand Jury was convened to investigate. And on September 2nd, 1907, the grand jury returned its indictments. James User was indicted for the wounding of the young white man in front of the post office. Samuel Burton and Sylvanus Conquest were indicted for the taking of the life of John Toppin, the black man who was accidentally struck when the carriage was fired upon. Toppin died in jail from lockjaw. Now remember, no one saw Samuel or Sylvanus that night. They weren't seen firing a weapon. They weren't ever seen near the road, but it didn't matter. They were going to pay for the entire thing. The men were brought back to Onancock on September 6th to stand trial. Judge John W.G. Blackstone presided. The men knew they would not get a fair trial, so they requested a change of venue to move the case to another county, but their request went nowhere. Judge Blackstone didn't like Governor Swanson, and he used this moment to say so. He claimed that the entire affair had been blown out of proportion by a governor who, in his words, was known for spectacle. He denied the motion. What followed were not real trials. They were formalities. Wearing the clothes of law, but carrying out the wishes of Jim Crow. Even though white citizens came forward to testify on James' behalf, to speak of his good character, it was no use. He was convicted quickly and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Samuel Sylvanus didn't fare any better. There was no evidence tying them to the attack on the carriage, but they were both convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. They appealed their convictions all the way to the Virginia Supreme Court, and to the surprise of many, the court agreed to hear the case. In January of 1908, the court reversed their convictions. It ruled that the men had not received a fair trial. But Jim Crow wasn't finished. The men were tried again in April of that year. And just like before, white residents came forward to testify for James. Other witnesses also testified. None were able to say that they saw the men that night. James was found not guilty, but Samuel and Sylvanus were still convicted. They were sentenced to 1 year in prison this time. Now, there's more to this story, but can we just pause for a moment to take in what happened to James User? The fact that he was found not guilty is truly astonishing. He did fire at that white man. That part was not in dispute. His only defense was that he fired to save his own life. But when had that ever worked? When had a black man's fear for his life ever been enough to justify force against a white man, especially in court, especially in 1907. Most of the time, a black man wouldn't even make it to trial. The mob would handle it. The rope would handle it. And the law will look the other way. So the fact that James stood trial, that he lived through it, and he was acquitted, that stopped me in my tracks. I mean, truly. But what about Samuel and Sylvanus? Well, they again appealed their convictions. And once again, the Virginia Supreme Court overturned them. This time, the court said that there was no evidence connecting either man to the crime. The prosecution had a choice to make. Would it try the men again? Finally, on October 26, 1908, the Commonwealth's attorney announced that it would be, in his words, useless to continue the case. The charges were dropped, and Samuel and Sylvanus were set free, allowed to return to their lives. But how do you move on after this? How do you go back to life after your store has been burned, your name has been dragged through the dirt, and your only crime was standing tall? Anger over black people demanded more dignity, more justice, more wages. That's what sparked this entire storm. The fear and the panic and the violence. All of it rooted in one truth. White rule demanded black silence. It demanded that black people work, not speak, serve, not organize, survive, but not resist. One group wanted to keep its foot on the neck of the other. Black people wanted to rise, to stand tall, to speak loudly, to claim the freedom that they were promised. And that came with a cost. That's the reality we see playing out again and again in our history. This wasn't just about Onancock. It was about the rules of Jim Crow, rules written to punish black hope. Samuel, James, and Sylvanus, they weren't just punished for what they did. They were punished for what they represented: black self-worth, black leadership, black community. And to white rule, that's always been the greatest threat of all. This story has been a lot. We saw how resistance turned to retribution. But there's still more. There's another part of the story. More resistance. And once again, it involves Samuel Burton. After the riot in 1907, Samuel lost everything. His business was burned to the ground, his wealth stolen, property confiscated. Everything he had worked for was gone. And he couldn't rebuild in Onancock because he was banished. It was no longer safe for him to remain. His life was literally in danger if he stepped foot in that town. So he left. He had to start over from nothing, with nothing. He made his way to Baltimore, Maryland. Once there, he scrapped and scratched to survive. He got a job as a clerk in a store, back behind the counter, back on his feet, doing what he knew how to do best. And with each passing day, he remembered what he had built, his life, his community, what he had, and what he lost. And it bothered him. This was America. Slavery was over. He was a citizen. And as a citizen, he had rights. He didn't want to just take this injustice and move on. Now, to be clear, he could have done that. No one would have shamed him for walking away and never looking back. If he said, "I'm getting out of this ring with Jim Crow," and letting him have the victory, we would have understood that. But that wasn't Samuel Burton. And in Baltimore, he found a community. In Baltimore, Samuel wasn't alone, because Baltimore wasn't just a big city. It was a black city. By the early 1900s, Black Baltimore had one of the largest populations of successful black people in the country. There were black teachers and black lawyers, black doctors and black businesses, a black community that knew how to organize. This wasn't the Deep South, but it wasn't free from racism either. In fact, Baltimore became the first city in America to pass a residential segregation law banning black people from moving into white communities. And the law was passed because a black lawyer named George McMeacham moved into a white neighborhood. McMeacham shared the law firm with another black attorney, W. Ashby Hawkins, who was the actual owner of the home. Hawkins filed suit in court to challenge the law. There's too much to say about Hawkins and not enough time to do him justice. But what I will say is that he was a legal giant long before the rise of Thurgood Marshall and the other legal titans of the modern civil rights movement. He led the NAACP's battle against residential discrimination in the 1910s. And in the 1920s, he became the first black person to run for the U.S. Senate in Maryland. Hawkins didn't just practice the law. He practiced resistance. He used the legal system as a weapon against injustice. And when Samuel Burton arrived in Baltimore with no money and no store, and a fire of injustice still burning inside of him, it was Hawkins who stepped in to help him. Attorney Hawkins wasn't just someone who cared about where black people could live. He also cared about how they lived. Like Samuel, Hawkins was deeply committed to advocating for higher wages for black workers. He was a member of Baltimore's Defense League, a black civic group engaged in the wage labor movement. So when he met Samuel and heard his story, how he was run out of town for demanding fair pay, how everything he had built was burned to the ground, he knew he had to help him. And in September of 1910, 3 years after the riot that destroyed his life, Attorney Hawkins filed a 12-page lawsuit in federal court on Samuel's behalf for what happened in Onancock. He filed it against the town of Onancock, the supervisors of Accomack County, Constable Tank Kellum, Sheriff Lee Kellum, Mayor Doherty, John West, and Upshur Sturgis. The suit alleged that all of these men conspired to violate Samuel's constitutional rights. The lawsuit said that at the time of the riot, Samuel's store was making over $10,000 a year, and that he lost the income, and even worse, his credit was ruined with wholesale houses in Baltimore and Philadelphia when he could no longer pay his accounts. He also said that the year he spent in prison before being acquitted caused him severe emotional and mental injuries. Samuel Burton was seeking justice, and he was asking for $100,000 in damages. Now, this was not a small thing. It's not like today when people say they're going to sue the police or the city. This was 1913. Segregation was in full effect. Access to justice for black people was practically non-existent. So for Samuel to do this, to walk into federal court and file a civil rights lawsuit against the entire town and its leaders, was extraordinary. He wasn't just seeking money. He was asking the law to acknowledge that what was done to him was wrong, that it mattered. And people took notice. Local black newspapers reported on the lawsuit, and The Crisis, the monthly publication of the NAACP, ran a story on Samuel's case in its March 1913 issue. Samuel's story and his continued fight for justice spread all across the country. He had been silenced in Onancock, but now the whole nation was watching. This case would end up being a 3-year saga. From the very beginning, the town and its officials did everything they could to get it thrown out. The case was brought before federal judge Edmund Waddell, and he ruled that the lawsuit was legally sound, that it deserved to be heard before a jury, that it must be tried on its merits. And after years of delays and obstruction, the case finally went to trial in January of 1913. Samuel was the first witness to take the stand, and he told the all-white jury exactly what happened. He told them how it all started, over a $2 debt, how he had nothing to do with the riot. He told them how everything he had worked for was taken from him, burned to the ground. He told them that he could never go back to Onancock, that his life would be in danger if he did. And he wasn't the only one. Other witnesses came forward to back him up. Even during the trial, even after everything that had come out, Onancock's official trial once more to get the case thrown out of court, but the judge overruled them again. Finally, after days of testimony, the jury began deliberations. And when the all-white jury came back, it delivered a verdict that shocked me. The jury ruled in favor of Samuel and found that the town officials had violated his rights. They awarded Samuel $3,500 in damages. That's the equivalent of about $115,000 today. But Onancock's officials still refused to accept defeat. They filed a motion for a new trial, but the judge denied it. He upheld the jury's verdict. Still, they did not stop. They appealed the case to the federal appellate court. 1 month later, in February of 1913, Samuel the town finally agreed to reach a settlement. Samuel would accept $2,000 and all legal proceedings would be dismissed. After he won the settlement, Samuel didn't just take the money and disappear. He invested it. He opened a new clothing store in Baltimore. And just like he had done in Onancock, he found success. In his first year of operation, in 1917, his store brought in $17,000. The next year, $35,000. By 1920, Samuel Burton was making $60,000 a year. That's nearly $1 million today. And this wasn't some backroom corner shop. Samuel built something real. He was known across the black community for providing high-quality clothing, with pride and with dignity and with excellence. He ran ads in black newspapers. He offered sales at Christmas and at Easter. And he did something else that he had done before. He hired black people to work in his store. Because for Samuel, success didn't mean rising alone. It meant rising together. Samuel continued to resist. And the same message he was preaching in the fields, in the storefronts of Onancock, do more, demand more, rise higher, he now applied to his own life. They stripped him, shamed him, slandered him, but he stood. Because we as a people, we are not easily erased. We're not easily extinguished. We can be bent, but not broken. Shaken, but not shattered. Down, but not defeated. Because we endure, and we resist. And Samuel, he got it all back. Every single thing that was taken, every dollar that was stolen, every lie that was told, he got it all back. And more was added to him. His success was his resistance. His comeback was his counterattack. Jim Crow thought that he had the final word, but hatred and lies cannot outlast hope and truth. You can knock us down, but we rise. You can burn our homes and our businesses, but we rebuild. You can bury the truth, but it will rise again. Because telling our stories is not just remembrance, it's resistance. Every time we tell the truth, we say we are still here. Every time we lift up the names they tried to erase, we say we survived. Every time we carry a memory forward, we say we remember. And that's what we are doing. We are remembering. Because remembrance is a form of resistance. And memory is a form of justice. That's what the Memory Justice Project is about. It's not just about the past. It's about presence. It's about dignity. It's about truth. Told by us, carried by us, and preserved by us. We don't know what happened to Samuel later in life. The 1940 census shows him living in Baltimore, and that's the last public record we've been able to find. But that's all right, because we still got to tell his story. We got to show how this giant of a black man survived everything Jim Crow threw at him. It was reported that James Usel also moved to Baltimore. As for Savannah's conquest, he left Onancock and moved to Lynchburg, Virginia, and eventually he made his way to Philadelphia. He died in September of 1921. This story showed us something deep. It showed us how black resistance can be waged in our hearts and in our minds and in the courts that tried to shut us out. It introduced us to a new cast of characters, names we weren't taught in school, but names we need to remember in our story of struggle. It reminded us that we've been resisting at every step, in every town, in every era of injustice that we've lived through. And I hope you learned something, because I know I did. This was the second story in our Black Resistance series, but I'll be back in the next video with another name, another face, another fight for dignity. And in our next chapter, we're headed down south to Alabama, where one black man, just trying to get home, ran straight into Jim Crow. But before we get there, I want to hear your voice too. Had you ever heard of the Onancock Riot? What did it teach you? How did it make you feel? Leave me a comment and let me know. And I'll see you in the next chapter.